We've discussed a community that is feeling stressed out and maxed, and we are very concerned with our friends and neighbors and our coworkers. We are looking for an new and perhaps out-of-the-box thinking on housing, and we don't know what those are. I think Arn helped us understand that the folks in Cheyenne are not going to let us do a lot of the creative stuff that we may want to do. And we also need to be mindful that we as a community need to engage and recognize that we are not liked in Cheyenne, and we need to really be unified in our conversations and our outreach and our engagement to ensure the future of Teton County.
Thanks, John. Tim Harland. We had a great discussion because we had a lot of different viewpoints as well. We have some people from Teton Valley, Teton, Wyoming, and we talked about a lot about Star Valley as well. But obviously one of the big things that Jonathan spoke about was growth. And growth seems to be the helium that's filling our balloon right now. And to be able to let that balloon fly is one way to look at things, but also to watch it pop is another. So we want to make sure that that growth is manageable. We know there's going to be growth, but we want to make sure that it's going to be manageable, so that it's going to be a benefit to our community, to future generations, and for that it will be positive growth and meaningful growth within our areas. You know, you look around us and it's hard not to love this place, but sometimes we can love our place to death. And we seem to be doing that in some regards, or at least in some aspects of people's opinions with regards to that. But how do we have solutions? Well, there needs to be a cohesive plan. And the nice thing about having people within our region is that to work with not just the people within Jackson Hole, but the people in Teton County, Idaho, the people down in Star Valley, to be able to manage things, because we do know we have a feeder community. People are coming in from those different areas, and there's going to be costs and benefits with that. You know, the places that people are coming from eventually might live down in that area permanently, and then we lose that workforce. But there are a couple statements that came out of our table. We definitely don't have a planning deficit or necessarily a governmental deficit, but we might have a communication deficit on when we come up with ideas, how do we explain those to the community so that they can be more widely accepted. Some of the solutions that we talked about is, Joe had some points with regards to funding. We certainly, once we have funding, actually we need to have a plan first and be able to say, hey, this is what we want to do with it. Then we can go ask for money, and that'll make it a little easier, whether that's through real estate transfer tax, lodging tax, increasing that. Or someone even had the idea of geotag tax. Whenever you take a picture and it's geotagged, that gets taxed. So there's lots of different things that we can do and come up with some creative solutions for some of the problems that we've created.
We also had a really lively conversation with diverse backgrounds in our group. And the same themes came up in terms of growth and talking about what build out is going to look like, because growth is inevitable. We did have an interesting perspective on defining what the region is. And maybe it's more than just beyond Teton County, Wyoming, and Teton Valley and Star Valley, but it expands to other parts of Wyoming, and looking at what sustainability is in terms of energy and food production. And so that was an interesting aspect. We also talked about what the population growth is going to look like in terms of racial and economics, and workforce. Of course, the workforce housing came up in terms of people importing workforces for getting jobs done versus finding labor here and how challenging that is. We talked about clean energy development, wildlife corridors, and also just having common ground and listening to the opinions and values of others that may differ from the values in this county. So that was the summary of our conversation.
The instructions were to come up with the one most important thing that we could think of. Too many people. You know, we've got permanent residents, we've got many seasonals, we've got a workforce, and we've got way too many tourists, and lots of other issues, lots of discussion around the table, but that's the one probably that came to the top of the list. And the one action that we could all kind of agree on is let's stop promoting tourism. Let's stop building more tourist beds. Let's solve the problem of too many people.
Good morning. We discussed, I think, a variety of things that we think are very important to know, from how many degrees of climate change will we experience here in Jackson Hole to how to rally apathetic community members, what is the comfortable carrying capacity of Jackson Hole, and then really closed in on this, how to maintain and improve the quality of life, how to fund government services, how to plan for the impacts of what were named amenity migrants. And so I would say we really kind of coalesced on the one action in talking about the need for new sources of government revenue. We talked about the fact that, as Jonathan laid out in his presentation to start us out this morning, the town of Jackson is reliant for 72% of their funding on sales tax, and yet we have a community who's saying no more tourists. And so how do we bridge that gap? And how do we really look in the mirror in an honest way and fund what our community is asking for today, and also plan for the future for our children? We talked about opportunities for funding. We by no means have a solution, but we discussed options in terms of what's on the table currently, that there is another cent of sales tax that is available, spet tax or general sales tax, that the town of Jackson does have the ability to levy a property tax. There's currently 0 mills of property tax levied by the town of Jackson. The real estate transfer tax that has long been discussed here for Teton County. And then, as long as we're talking about things that require changes at the state level, I had to throw in, and I'm not sure that anyone at my table supported me, but discussion of an income tax in Wyoming. And again, that comes from Jonathan's presentation when you look at the amount of income that's generated here from investment, and just, again, looking in the mirror and being honest as we look at a stable, diverse funding source.
Hi, I'm Nancy Shea. And, sort of ditto, a lot of what's already been brought up, we talked about it at our table. And we were an interesting group of people, business people, architects, educators, scientists, public land managers. And we did end up spending a lot of time talking about, sort of in a way, Jonathan's idea of co-thriving. How is that even possible, and can we pull that off? Because it does seem so polarized around that notion of what's the priority, the people or the land. So we went around and around. One thing that perhaps is a little bit to add to the conversation is we decided, or at least one of us brought it up, and maybe we all kind of agreed, that maybe we should pat ourselves on the back a little bit, that in a way, we've done okay. We've really, one of the comparisons, of course, was something like Aspen, Colorado. And, if you compare those two places, maybe we're doing better than we could have done. So there's a way in which we don't want to get too discouraged, because then we'll just sort of write it off as a done deal. So the engagement of this community in these issues, as is this gathering we're having right now, is a good sign. So our public land manager here, the head of the Bridger Teton, she was part of a process called scenario planning. So this is our proposal to put on the table, and you actually get together and you look at specific scenarios and you see the good, what's the pro and the con out of that particular scenario, as another way to begin to build a picture of what we could do here and what it might look like. There you go.
We were talking about the issue around diversity and housing and ecology and the nature connection and recreation, whether it's the same or different. Another piece which was around our connection with Greater Wyoming and our lack of awareness about who they are, as opposed to their actually having some idea of who we are, because they come here, but we don't go out into the Greater Wyoming. We talked about the tourists, that there's the same number of beds essentially here for tourists to stay in town and whatnot, but there is this expanded base now with the Airbnb concept as well, and that our community is not defined purely by the tourists, the community is defined by us, because we have grown into a full-fledged community in our own right. We talked a little bit about build-outs, and better way of expressing ourselves, and just having a greater awareness of and defining our fundamental values around this diversity in housing, ecology, and even our economic value. Is it all about growth? I think that does it. Anything else? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Bob Frodeman. I live down in Hoback. In addition to all the comments, there's some common themes we've been hearing from all the comments so far. Something bubbled up from our table that as I've been listening to these comments, it becomes increasingly striking. And that's the notion of contradiction, that we're living in a contradiction. And the question is, how much longer can we continue to live in these contradictions? So, for instance, if there was one term that came up over and over again at our table, it was sustainability. At the same time, as one of our members said, population growth is inevitable. That's not going to work. How do we live through and solve this contradiction? Or again, how do we deal with the fact that we want to fix things locally, but we're tied into a national and a global economy and politics and a technology? How can we control population or visitation when we have plane loads of people coming from all around the world? We are struggling with these contradictions. Another contradiction is that we all love it here, but we also want to lock the door behind us. That's not quite fair. How do we acknowledge that we have responsibilities to people around the planet? So now if there was one suggestion that came from our conversation, it was stop advertising to bring more people.
I'm Jeff from Teton Valley, and we had a pretty diverse group as well, representing multiple jurisdictions and agencies, as well as members of the public. And our conversation all kind of, we were sort of all over the place, but everything sort of came back to this notion that miraculously, as Jonathan pointed out in his presentation, we've managed to establish some kind of balance between allowing for growth of the human element through growing economies, growing revenues, growing governments, growing towns and communities, with preserving that natural amenity that is the reason so many of us are here in the first place. So how do we reconcile the fact that pressure is going to continue to be placed on the desire to continue to increase those economies, the desire of people to move here for lifestyle choices or other reasons? And how do we balance that with the need to preserve the balance that we have in place, if not even swing that balance a little more in favor of continuing to advocate and work for maintaining our natural amenities here? And one of the things that we talked a little bit about that I'll just throw out there as a possible action that could be taken collectively, and this is something that Commissioner Newcomb and I heard about a little bit when we were at a conference up in Canmore this past fall, was the idea that communities that have been successful in maintaining that balance or establishing that balance, coming from a place where it wasn't balanced to a place where it is balanced, have prioritized environmentally driven decision making, where the impact of decisions on the surrounding environment and the broader regional ecosystem are first and foremost at the front of the decision-making process at all levels.
At our table, we found that the sort of intractable problem we all face is housing and population, and its effects on whether it's wildlife, our history, our culture, trying to maintain some sense of that. really, as we look ahead, the thing we all face is the fact that market forces are what they are. And if left to the market and population growth, chances are, given what we're doing today, we're going to be asking the same questions 10 years down the road. Things we kind of bounced around as ideas for dealing. I think a big one, to sum it up, would be that there's not one idea. To hear what Jonathan was saying earlier, if economics moved first, then the answer is probably found not by talking to government or trying to regulate our way to a point where we solve the problem, but rather to have lots of different groups throughout the region throw ideas out there to see what sticks. Whether it's transportation, whether it's regionality, whether it's housing in other places, whatever that might be, there's just not going to be one answer, and we need to keep throwing things out there to see what sticks and works.
We touched on a lot, one might even say rambled, but I think we did agree with many of you that the growth is unsustainable. Having twice the growth just by right now, doubling of our community in the future, seems like too much to most of us. We do acknowledge the need for a healthy economy, and the expansion of tourist growth goes hand in hand with that. We did, the career conservationists and the one person at the table that was born and grew up here did not think we've done a very good job protecting the environment in our valley, and we had a number of examples of that. Climate change affects everything. Kate Mead told us that they hay 1 month earlier than they used to. Just one example of that that's going to really impact us. And of course, we talked about the decline of coal and the impact it'll have on the state's economy and to a certain extent our economy. We talked about considering the region more expansively and finding ways to reach out and get to know people in other counties better than we do. And the flip side of that coin was to continue to make the case in Cheyenne for local control, that, you know, for home rule, that we really can know best how to zone our county than Cheyenne can. We have another number of recent examples of that. You know, if we want to have wildlife-friendly fencing, we should be able to do that. We talked about wanting to have high aspirations and ambitious vision. You know, maybe even consider that tunnel to Teton County, Idaho. But while we're considering that, let's have a couple more buses going over there every day to make it possible for people to use them. Let's talk about wildlife crossings, but let's also talk near term about slowing down in some of the critical wildlife spots. So we talked about that as well. Finally, we didn't finish the conversation on what it is we need to know that we don't know, but I think we kind of thought that, you know, we know a lot, and rather know more, we need to do more.
One of the things I got at, one of the things we talked about the most was transportation and coordinating transportation with our, you know, our expanded region. And then the other thing that we didn't really say per se, but it was my interpretation, and that is that, you know, as many issues as we have with our local planning and you know what our vision is for locally, the bigger impact is the tourism and how we deal with that. And so, you know, to me, that is the more impactful push on our local economy and environment, and something that, you know, we should consider first. And then, you know, the other thing was talking about, you know, revenues and lost revenues and how we make up for that. But that was it.
We talked about a lot of things. I think the topics that stand out for us were similar in terms of growth management. Having a plan for infrastructure and having a plan that's flexible, that we can adjust, but making sure we pay attention to the plan. We did talk about the fact that demand is always going to exceed supply here for people that want to come here. And so how do we deal with that? And also the fact that roughly half the homes in this valley are going to be occupied or are occupied less than 6 weeks a year. And so how do we engage people that are not really permanent members of the community that are skewing that investment income side, but aren't really taking part as much as they could be or should be, or do we want them to take part, frankly? I mean, that's a question that's still outstanding. I think as far as types of solutions, really we just talked about being collaborative instead of being adversarial. I think that was something that there's lots of different interest groups out there that want to promote their interests, and that's the way it works here in this country. But in order to be able to get anything done, we need to find a way to work together better and be able to communicate with each other, and not just sort of, love Jonathan's idea of a blue ribbon commission. I'm going to get in trouble here because we talked here about whether it should include elected officials or not, and my view is a commission like that shouldn't include elected officials initially, and then eventually, yeah, Andy especially, and then eventually, of course, you have to, but make it something that's really a grassroots level view of who we are and where we want to be, and then let that bubble up to as the conversation continues. So we don't really have any long answers, but the last thing I'd say is regionality. We talked a lot about being more regional, how people in the state view us differently from the rest of the state, and how we could do a better job of reaching out to the rest of the state, even just regionally, Fremont, Lincoln, other places around near us, Uinta, where we could establish relationships and maybe just find ways to work together to better not just Teton County, but the state of Wyoming as well.
I want to riff on something Nancy Shea did. How great was this? That was just a really cool thing. Would you all give yourselves a hand? This is to bring 125 super energized people out for it's getting to be a better looking day. But it's just, what an extraordinary gathering. And to your point, Nancy, to your table's point, we have so much that we are doing so well, and why we're here is because we want to do it better. And what an extraordinary dynamic, what an extraordinary vibration. So thank you all so very much for being part of that. I can't help myself, but I'm going to throw in a factoid, but it plays into some of these concepts of regionality and transportation. There are about 3,200 counties in America. And of those, about 1,900, including Teton County, Wyoming, have 20,000 or more people, so the larger counties. In all those 1,900, if you take the number of jobs and you divide it into the residents, the U.S. average is about 0.65 jobs per resident. So 2/3 of a job per permanent resident, which makes sense if you think about kids and senior citizens and this, that, and the other. 6 of those 1,900 counties have more than one job per person. Number 1 is New York City. They have 1.85, so 3 times the national average. And if you think about it, it's all those commuters coming in. They're coming in from Connecticut or Westchester County or New Jersey or what have you. But they have 1.85 jobs. There are 5 other counties in America that have more than one job per person. Boston, DC, Atlanta, San Francisco, Teton County, Wyoming. We have 1.4 jobs per permanent resident. That puts us second to New York City. All the others are right around 1.1. We have big city transportation problems with 40,000 people in our metropolitan area, the metropolitan area, as opposed to tens of millions. And so it creates, in terms of the richness of the problems that we have, when you think about regionality, we simply don't have the masses to make really high quality or the kind of rapid transit that we'd like to have, or mass transit. So that's why we have a lot of cars and a lot of single occupancy vehicles. It's what we have to do, but it's an extraordinary dynamic that we have this big city problem with a small city population.